All right, looks like we're live. So I'd like to welcome Tim Andersen and Jared Preisler, who are with me, for a practical guide to neighborhood analysis is what we're calling this. So just by way of introduction, my name is Marty Hamilton. I work for DataMaster. And I will turn it over to Tim and to Jared. So Tim, would you like to go first and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Tim Andersen, and I work for Debbie Andersen. And have for 45 years, and I'm really grateful to have the work, quite frankly. Guys, thank you for letting me be here with you. I appreciate it very much. It's very kind of you. I'm an appraiser, MAI, USPAP instructor, and I've been doing this since before some of the listeners have been alive. So I have a vague clue as to what's going on. And we're going to talk about neighborhood analysis today to a great extent. And I think that's, as I review reports, one of the areas that I notice that appraisers need some extra oomph on is the neighborhood analysis from a standpoint, not that appraisers don't take a look at the neighborhood and say, well, there's an A and there's a B and there's a C, but they take a look at the neighborhood and say there's an A and there's a B and there's a C, and that's it. They don't say, well, there's an A and here's what it means, and there's a B and this is why there's a B, and here's a C and here's how C influences the subject's marketability and value. And that's what Fannie Mae is looking for, more so than, say, would an appraisal done for a divorce. But when you're working with Fannie Mae or any of the other GSEs, one of the areas they're looking at extremely closely is that of risk. They're buying, the bank sells the paper. So, the bank's at risk for what, 10 days? But the investors are at risk for until the loan's paid off. So while that may be 3 years, that may be 5 years, maybe 30 years. So they want to know what's going on in that neighborhood from the standpoint of what are the risks of investing in mortgages in that neighborhood. And as appraisers answer that question, those questions, appraisers are taking a step that an AVM just can't take, that a BPO just can't take, that a CMA just can't take. All those do is take data and basically regurgitate it. We've got to do, or I should say we get to do, the analysis that answers the question, why? And as we do that, we take a step that shows that we are absolutely essential to the mortgage lending process, whereas the other stuff, AVMs, CMAs, BPOs, etc., aren't. So we're in a position to leverage the data that we have, the information that we have, and turn it into something that the client really, really needs. Now, can somebody take the data and say, well, the average sale in the neighborhood was $137 a square foot and apply that to the subject? Yeah, sure, anybody can do that. That doesn't take any brains or talent. What takes brains and talent is saying, well, it was $147 a square foot, and here's why. And yes, that does, or no, that doesn't apply to the subject.
Yeah, Tim, I think you make a great point, a couple of really good points. When I'm reviewing work as well, I see the same thing, the same challenges that you're outlining. I look at it more as job security. So I've been appraising about 25 years now, joined the DataMaster team in 2016. But in joining them, I kept and maintained my own fee appraisal business. So I do 30 plus appraisals a month, and I'm in the field asking and answering those questions about the neighborhood all the time, reviewing work, still very active, and I look at it and I say, what can I tell my client that they can't get somewhere else, that they can't get by an automated tool, where they can't smell the property, they can't see what the topography is a lot of times, or what the external influences are of that busy street. Maybe it looks like a thicker road on the map, but what does that really mean? Is that a transportation node? Is that good? Is that bad? And that's where us asking or answering the why questions I think are so important, especially when it comes to the neighborhood and how the subject fits in with that particular market and neighborhood. I also think, Tim, it's one of those things that is an introduction here. I think that appraisers sometimes are a little confused on the neighborhood. Is it competing properties? Is it all the properties around? Is it the house, just the houses next door on the same plat in the same subdivision? What really is the neighborhood? And I often from those reports will see that that might be a bit of an area of confusion with reference to what our client's expectation is, what our client's needs are, what their scope of work might be. So but I think it's a great place for us to tell the story and add value to our to our expertise and to our line of work.
Yeah, as we can answer that why question, then what we're doing is we're telling the client, the intended user, the story that an AVM just can't tell. It's not designed to tell it. So we get to tell a story. We're authors, as it were. And when we sit down at the computer and we start typing, yes, we have to provide the client with the recitation of facts of what's going on. But then we have to say to the client, look, this property is worth $350,000, and here's why. And then go through all the reasons why it's worth $350,000. Why do people want to buy here? Why do people want to go to these schools? Why is someone willing to pay $350,000 when they can go 20 miles away and get essentially the same house for maybe $50,000 less? There's a reason for that, and that's what the client wants us to tell them. That's why the client retained us rather than a broker to run an AVM. Marty, we lost you there for a second. Your mic's dead.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay, sorry. I deprived you of my dulcet tones for a couple minutes. So thanks for the for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I just wanted to say that Tim recently wrote an essay that's 36 answers you need to know now, understanding neighborhood analysis. And it's an excellent tool to help you understand neighborhood analysis. He really put a lot of time and effort into it. So we're going to dive into some of those questions in just a minute. But first, I have a question about technology. So what, in your opinion, and with your knowledge of Advisory Opinion 37, is the correct role of technology in determining the neighborhood and market and trends?
Jared, you want to jump in there?
Sure. I'll start on this one. So Advisory Opinion 37, as many of you will remember, USPAP has advisories at the end, kind of towards the end, sandwiched between the standards and rules and FAQs. That's where we find those advisory opinions. Advisory Opinion 37 is one of the more recent advisory opinions, and it deals with computer-assisted valuation tools. And that can be anything from a sketching tool, a laser measure, to a sophisticated multiple regression analysis tool. And the main theme of, or the issue and the main theme that the foundation had, the standards board had, was that appraisers are using these tools and not understanding how the tool works. And so with reference to a neighborhood analysis or trying to use a tool to derive some trending information, as the appraiser, you need to understand how that tool works, what type of data makes it work, that makes it work so that it's reflective of the market. Not every tool that is out there will work in every single market. Often they have their own regional nuances, where because maybe basements are important in one area, or off-street parking might be critically important in one area where it's just not as important in another area. If the tool doesn't account for that, then you might be misusing or misreading the results of that tool. So not only understanding how it works, understanding the right kind of data to give the tool, and then interpreting what that means, understanding what's the dispersion, what are all the terms, and what the tool's trying to tell us, interpreting it the correct way. That's really Advisory Opinion 37 tells us that's our responsibility as the appraiser. It also suggests, and there's a place I love this where it says, if you put garbage data in, you're going to get garbage data out. Most of these tools, they're not a magic button where they mysteriously and magically change the data to be good. If you're not feeding it the right information, the right data set, then you're not going to get good results. But it's our responsibility. I can't say the AVM made me do it, or the regression model made me do it. It's my responsibility as the appraiser. That's how I see AO 37, or my interpretation of it.
Our mutual friend Craig Morley, who used to be on the board, tells a great story. Some appraisers bought some regression software off the shelf, and knowing absolutely nothing about regression analysis, started using it. And of course, they almost immediately got in trouble with the state. So they're up before the state board, and Craig says to them in so many words, well, okay, you did this regression, but why did you do it the way you did it? And they said, well, look right here. It shows that these properties have a really high standard deviation. And of course, the higher the number, the better. So we look for properties with really high standard deviations, when no, that's not what you're supposed to do. There's supposed to be a really small standard deviation, and a high standard deviation says, no, you better get some other sales because these aren't going to work. So if you're going to use a tool, great, use a tool. But number one, you got to know what it is that it does. Number two, you got to know how to use it. And then number three, and this is probably the important part, is all it is a tool. And you have to take a look at the output of that tool and say, okay, does this really help me answer the question, or does it not help me answer the question? And if it doesn't help you answer the question, you put it in the work file and you pick up another tool and start over again. But while I personally recommend the use of regression analysis, I don't know how many of you know George Dell, ever heard of him? George is saying that appraisers probably shouldn't be using regression analysis because it implies that the appraiser is using a sample of data out of a larger universe of data. And in appraising, there usually isn't a larger universe of data. If you got 10 sales, that's probably all there are. So to use a universe of data and run it through a program that is designed to interpret a sample of data will give you a mathematically correct answer, but it will be mathematically correct garbage. So appraisers don't need mathematically correct garbage. Appraisers need to know what they're doing, need to analyze the data, and then when they get those data, not only what do those data mean, but why do those data mean that? And until we're in that position, then the AVMs are going to look pretty good to the lenders because it tells them what the property is worth. It really doesn't, but they think they do. Whereas when we can say, well, your property is worth $350,000, and here's why, and here are the influences in the neighborhood that make it worth $350,000, and here are the trends in the neighborhood that indicate that, well, the values could change tomorrow. They probably won't. Then appraisers are going to go, oh, wow, I really don't need an AVM. I need the guys over at DataMaster to help me out to come up with an absolutely reasonable and credible value opinion.
Great.
I couldn't agree more, Tim.
Right. And I love that example of the standard deviation being high.
Yeah.
And not understanding what standard deviation means and how far away you're getting from the spot where you want to be.
Well, bigger is better, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great example. So I want to jump over to your essay, if we could, for a little bit, and kind of go through a couple of these questions that I took notes on. And forgive me, my notes are on a different screen, so I'm going to be looking elsewhere for a minute while I ask these questions. But I wanted to start with question number 9 and kind of work through question 9 through 12. And this has to do with the steps that an appraiser takes to perform a neighborhood analysis. So I'm going to read question 9. It says, what are the 3 steps in which the appraiser engages to perform a neighborhood analysis? And my question is, what is the pertinent data appraisers should use when performing a neighborhood analysis? So the first step is pertinent data. What is that pertinent data?
Well, collecting pertinent data means the appraiser, whether he or she goes through the neighborhood or not, is going to look at MLS, going to look at the public record, whatever those sources of information may be, and collect the data that have something to do with the subject. I remember a number of years ago reading about a 200-page commercial appraisal on an adult congregate living facility. And fully 30% of the pages in that appraisal had to do with the conditions of industrial real estate in that particular county. And when we got the appraiser and said, okay, this is wonderful, but you're appraising an ACLF, why in the world have you got 30-ish pages about the industrial market in this particular county? The response in so many words was, well, if I didn't include that, the report would have been too short. And yeah, it probably would have, but it also would have been a whole lot more relevant. So when we're looking at pertinent data, this is what we mean from a standpoint of what does Fannie Mae want in the 1-unit housing trends on page 1 versus the data at the top of page 2. Well, on page 1, Fannie Mae is looking for the sales, the predominant price, etc., of properties that are generally like the subject. For example, if you're dealing with a condominium along a lakefront someplace, then the subject or Fannie Mae is really not interested in what duplexes are selling for, because that's not pertinent. Whereas on the top of page 2, Fannie Mae is specifically saying, all right, we don't want to know anything except about lakefront condos, and ideally in that same building, because in different buildings, there'll be different influences. So when we talk about collecting pertinent data, what we're talking about is collecting data that is relative to answering the appraisal question, which 99 times out of 100 is, what is the market value of this particular property? That's what pertinent means.
Hey, Tim.
Oh, yes, please.
Can I interject one thing? I was doing a study the other day where I had a 2-bedroom home, 1 bath, that had been remodeled very nicely. And the agent I talked to the agent verifying information. They had suggested that this particular market was just going gangbusters, that you just could not keep these in stock. If you had a dozen of these, they'd sell in an hour. And certainly in this market, there was an overall trend in this zip code of increasing properties values. And so an example of the pertinent, I went through and I did a study of what 2-bedroom homes were appreciating at or trending at versus what 3-bedroom or better homes were appreciating at. And there was a significant difference. The 2-bedroom homes were on a flat line. They were not appreciating. They were stable at best. And the inventory that was available where the 3-bedroom or better, those homes were desirable in that neighborhood, in that trend. And I could show the difference between what this, the pertinent data for my subject property that only had 2 bedrooms, it struggled in that market. The price point had got to where it didn't compete anymore. And what you're saying is, just kind of another example of how we need to understand what data is important. What are the key marketing factors? What are the key factors that the market wants on those particular homes, and then apply the right information to determine the trend or the neighborhood, what's going on in that area. The 2-bedroom homes just didn't compete with the 3-bedroom, no matter how much the agent said it did.
No, and that's why our friends in the lending community, in way too many cases, are drooling idiots, because they are going to try to tell us you can determine the value of a 3-bedroom home by bracketing with the value of a 2-bedroom home and the value of a 4-bedroom home. And no, you can't. Okay, but I'll get on my soapbox and rant about that on a totally separate occasion. But Jared, this goes back to your discussion on AO37. The MLS is a tool. It's a great tool. But if you just said, give me all the sales that are happening in this particular neighborhood and show me the trends, then yeah, you're going to have the 2-bedroom data and the 3-bedroom data and the 4-bedroom data. But the 3 and 4-bedroom data are not pertinent. And therefore, the answer you would get would be lovely, but utterly irrelevant. So therefore, you'd have to, and when I say you, I mean the appraiser, would have to make sure that the computer you were dealing with knew you just wanted data on 2-bedroom properties, not all the properties in the neighborhood.
Right. Marty, I think that's a great explanation to your question. How do we know it's pertinent? So that's a good way.
Yeah, that is good. And I love the fact that you brought it back to technology and that computers don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know how to calculate things that they're not. I mean, they don't understand the market themselves. You have to put the inputs in for it to make sense of it, to put it out. So thank you. I appreciate that. And then, I wanted to get into the forces at work and some examples of that. So do either of you have any interesting stories to illustrate economic, government, or environmental factors?
Can I jump in here with a story?
Love it. Go for it.
A number of years ago, a friend of mine down in Key West called me, and he needed some help with appraising a hotel down there. And he was a residential appraiser, and I'm a commercial appraiser. So I drove down to Key West, and which is not the worst duty in the world, especially on a sunny spring day. So I drove down there and left real early in the morning till we could get to the property about 9 o'clock when our appointment was. And it's absolutely gorgeous property. I mean, one of the most beautiful hotels I've ever seen anywhere. And it was on almost an acre site, which in Key West is a huge piece of ground. And once you got on the property, there were so many plants and trees that other than the occasional plane flying over, you couldn't hear anything. It was paradise. The original building was built right after the end of the Civil War. By the way, just a bit of trivia here. Key West was a northern town during the Civil War, and I'll explain that later if we ever have time. But it was very old, but it was the house was built out of wood imported from the Northeast. It was built out of oak or birch or maple, or the bugs wouldn't eat it, and it'll last forever. And it had beautifully high ceilings, which was common in those days because heat rose, and therefore it took the heat off the living area, the floor, so it helped keep rooms cool. And it was just a beautiful, old, large, stately home. It was being used technically it was a B&B, but we call it a hotel. And the current owners had built some more buildings on the site to house some other, what ended up being much more traditional hotel rooms. So we had walked through the property, and we'd gotten a lesson on the history of the plants on the property, and the University of Florida had declared the property some type of botanical sanctuary because there were plants there that weren't found anyplace else in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And we were getting ready to leave the property, and kind of as a joke, I said to the manager who was showing this through, "Is the property haunted?" And she looked at me and her jaw dropped. "How did you know?" So I said, "I didn't. I took a guess and it looked like I hit a home run." She goes, "Yeah, the property's haunted. And the original lady who built the house still lives here. And we see her. And in fact, her bedroom commands a premium because she comes into the bedroom and folds clothes while our guests are out." So when we were doing our due diligence, we're talking to other B&B owners, other small hotel owners. And one of the questions we asked was, "Is your property haunted?" And the answers, there were three: yes, no, and I damn sure hope so. So that was an environmental factor that brought people into the B&B, and they could advertise it. And in fact, it is very common for many older buildings to be quote unquote haunted. And it doesn't hurt anything really, assuming the haunting is benign. Now, there are other places where that's not true. And there's a great story told up in New Jersey. A couple that lived in a house for 30 years sold it. And about 6 months later, the new buyers sued them, trying to get the court to rescind the sale because the house was haunted. And the defendant's response was, "Yeah, we knew it was haunted, but we got along with the ghost just fine for 30 years. What's the problem?" And that's my phone, and I apologize to you for it. So let me... And
No, I
what's
like the
interesting,
song you've got
calling
playing.
me is the guy I appraised the hotel with in Key West. But maybe we'll have another assignment down there. But the point is, here was an environmental factor that affected value, in this case, positively. So now, am I saying every time you go into a house, do you ask if it's haunted? No. But the point is, you might have to ask some questions that you typically wouldn't ask in order to determine what the economic forces are in the neighborhood. Now, that's typically employment, new businesses forming, what is the local business tax rate, what's the local sales tax rate, that kind of thing. But the point is, we've got to ask, not merely assume, for the simple reason that, yes, if our comps are in the same neighborhood, then the influences are going to be the same. That's not an issue. But how many times, and Jarrett, you'll know this is true, how many times do you have to go outside of the neighborhood to find comps? And as a result, when you go outside of the neighborhood, are what influences the subject the same influences in another neighborhood? And if they are, fine, no problem. You don't have to adjust for them. If they're not, then you have to adjust for them. But the point is, if you're going outside of the neighborhood, you have to go through the analyses to determine how those influences influence the subject's marketability and value.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And I think you have to, like we were talking about before, tie it up in a bow at the end and say, I had to go out of the primary neighborhood because of this. And the three comparables I picked, or the two comparables outside that I found, have the same influence. They're in a submarket that's similar to the subjects, or they're not, and here's why. No adjustment was necessary. No site adjustment or location adjustment or whatever was necessary. I was reviewing a property the other day, a report the other day that had 4.5 acres of ground, but most of it was hillside, sloped, could not be subdivided, had a beautiful spring running through it, pond in one area that they had developed where some brook trout lived, down this private drive that was probably 1,500 feet long. And one of the comps that was used was another 4.5 piece of property, but it was down on the flats in a predominantly horse property community on a main road. And when I went to look at the property, the house had been torn down and they were setting footings for condominiums, townhomes. and no adjustment, no explanation in the report as to the difference. Yes, they both had 4 acres, but they were very different 4 acres, completely different. And I know the appraiser struggled to find other properties in the immediate neighborhood or primary neighborhood with that type of land, but didn't really represent the subject very well by going and using another 4-acre piece that was not reflective of the market, and so it caused some problems, and there were some things that had to be explained later on. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. I remember one of the other economic influences that I remember dealing with just recent. Well, it's probably been 4 or 5 years. There's a small county that I do quite a bit of appraising in, and it's very, very dependent on some government type contracts and school district employment. There's a couple of employers that service the automotive industry and the airline industry. And when one of those sectors is down, it certainly has a big impact on homes in the area, single family residents in the area. There was a Lazy Boy factory that decided to close, had 600 jobs, moving those jobs out of town. That was devastating to this community. That would impact nearly every single property owner in the county significantly. But shortly after that, a large paper manufacturer announced that they were going to build a brand new plant and made a 50-year commitment to the community in a state-of-the-art paper plant. And this roller coaster ride that this small county rides was very much stabilized by this one employer coming in and making that type of commitment. And over the next couple of years that happened after that, it's been amazing to see what the economic impact has been, and on not only home values, but a lot of other sectors in that area, their education, a lot of different things. But as an appraiser, I think we need to know those type of things. Those are key basic things that your geographic competency demands in those type of areas. Those are the things I should know when I'm appraising in that area.
Yeah, you have to be aware of what's going on, and while that's not terribly difficult to ascertain, it will take greater work, more work than is typical for the typical appraisal.
And just to follow up on that, on Jared's example, so how does an appraiser's analysis clarify the risk to investors above and beyond just a historical recitation? Like it's great to know what's happened, but how does that analysis come into play that the appraiser is doing on knowing the market, and the geographic competencies?
Well, I think our clients are really wanting to know how what's their risk with this particular property. They're using it as a security vehicle, securitizing that loan. And these economic forces or factors, if they're not very stable, or they are subjective or subject to change very, very rapidly, that could have an impact on that loan. That could have an impact on that property's acceptability in the market. If you have an under improvement or an over improvement in the property, the client wants to know that, because those under and over improvements have a greater risk profile. Those are the ones that maybe aren't going to be accepted by the majority of the typical buyers in the area. And it's connecting the dots. So here's this employer that moves into the area. Here's the type of jobs that they're going to bring. Here's the houses that are necessary for the households that are going to get those type of jobs. And that impacts risk in a positive way. It mitigates the risk because of this. Connecting those dots through, I think, are important. And remember, it's my opinion. If it proves out to be a little bit different, that's not. I'm not trying to predict or forecast, but I'm giving them the relevant things that I see as I'm interviewing agents, as I'm interviewing buyers and sellers in the area, reading the newspapers, right? The digital, watching the digital.
What's a newspaper, Jared?
Yeah, sorry, that was. But those are the things I think, Marty, that I remember sitting in a symposium a couple of years ago and having the chief risk manager for a lender presenting, and he said, I really want you guys as appraisers to give me more analysis, give me more of your opinion of how things apply. And he called it a B or C grade analysis, not just this A where I'm reporting, but connect it and tell me why that's important. He said that's what would be most helpful to him as a risk manager with the lender.
So that's our job, to not only say, well, okay, this particular factory is going to come in, this particular paper plant is going to come in, and the 600 people who are going to lose their job from the Lazy Boy factory closing are going to be given a job at the paper mill. Okay, yeah, that's no great secret. But then, is the paper mill going to replace those jobs with jobs that pay less or jobs that pay more? And then is the population in that particular area aging at a relatively rapid rate and therefore coming available to retire? That's what the client needs to know, the risk factors. Obviously, a new plant opening up says, okay, everybody's going to have a job and therefore they can make their mortgage payments. All right, that's not terribly risky. But if people are going to have a job, but at 25% lower income, yeah, that might be risky. Or if the population is aging and they're going to retire and move from Layton to St. George, that's going to put a whole lot of houses on the market, and that could push prices down. So it's our job to peer into the future. We can't predict the future, but we can say, well, okay, here are what the trends indicate. And if those trends carry forward, it's reasonable that X, Y, and Z will happen. If they don't, well, something else will. But at least then we've said, be aware of these potentialities rather than merely saying, yeah, the Lazy Boy plant is closing and the paper mill's going in.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Let's move on now. I'm going to move on to question 21. So that question says, when completing the one-unit housing trends portion of the neighborhood section of the appraiser report, those trends must be reflective of only what? And the answer here from Fannie Mae is, when completing the one-unit housing trends portion of this neighborhood section of the appraisal report forms, the trends must be reflective of those properties deemed to be competitive to the property being appraised. So I wanted to kind of get into this a little bit and talk about the difference between competitive properties and comparable properties. And maybe we could just start with a definition of competitive properties.
Well,
So,
Marty, before you do that, I think we should really highlight that Fannie Mae gives us the authority to deem a property. It's like a magic wand. I can deem something to be competitive.
Right.
I always find that word very, very interesting. That I don't know who else would deem it competitive other than me, the appraiser, or the appraisers that are listening to us. It's not the underwriter that deems it competitive. It's not the real estate agent or the but that word always, whenever I read this, it always kind of gets me that some sort of empirical authority that was given to us to be able to deem deem something necessary or competitive or whatever. Anyway, I pull us off track there. So competitive versus comparable versus similar versus whatever, are they all just are they all synonymous, or are there really differences?
Well, if I may jump in, if you look in the 14th edition of the Appraisal of Real Estate, and then Mark Ratterman's new book on residential real estate appraisal, a comparable property is one that has the same highest and best use of the subject. In other words, if it doesn't, then it's not comparable by definition. Whereas Fannie Mae doesn't narrow it down quite that far. It says competitive. Okay, if I go into a neighborhood and I really want to buy 1234 Elm Street, but for whatever reason I can't buy it. Somebody else makes a higher offer and they get it or something like that. If I can go to 1237 Elm Street and buy that house, and it satisfies the same needs and desires that 1234 Elm Street would have satisfied, then it's indeed competitive. Or if two houses are on the market at the same time and they would appeal to the same typical purchaser, if they're not that far terribly apart in price, if they're not that far terribly apart in amenities offered, etc., then they're probably competitive. So Fannie Mae is saying, all right, take a look at the neighborhood and ignore the geodesic dome that was built in 1960, because most of the other houses are ranch houses built in 1980 or later. So yeah, the geodesic home is in the neighborhood. Yeah, there are probably 12 people in the United States who want to buy a geodesic home, but there are most likely a whole lot more people who want to buy your typical ranch house in that particular neighborhood. So even though the geodesic home is for sale and probably has been for the last 5 years, it's really not terribly competitive with the subject, and it most definitely is not comparable.
I agree, Tim, and I think the thing I think about is we have sales and we have comparables, and there could be a lot of sales, but they might not be competitive or comparable, or a lot of listings that are not necessarily competing or competitive, and that's what I think. Apologize for that computer warning sound there, but that's when I'm often looking. I'll even sometimes find that a 2-story with a master suite on the main floor or a bedroom ensuite with on the main floor will compete in a very different market than one where all the rooms are on the second floor. And though to me, if I'm, in certain markets, I might kick out all those 2 stories that don't have main floor bedroom, where in other markets that might not be an issue at all. Whether it's got a main floor bedroom or all the bedrooms are upstairs, it might not matter at all, and they would all be competing. As the appraiser, we need to understand what drives that market, what features are most important. In my market, we get a lot of snow during different times of the year, and if you don't have off-street covered parking, that is a very different market. And so the fact that you've got an enclosed garage or some sort of off-street market might be a determining factor in what's competing and what's not competing. Style might not make a difference. I tell the experience all the time about horse property, where for my market, horse property folks, they're not so concerned about style as they are about the size of the land and the amenity. What's the barn like? Does it have culinary water out to it? Is there heat there? Is there power out to the barn? And often I'll their horses tend to live in more luxurious environments than their children do, and they spend more time in the outbuildings. They spend more time in those barns than they do in the house. And so the fact that the house is a is a ranch or a rambler or a 2-story or split entry or split level might not make one bit of difference in that in that market as to what's competing and what's not competing.
Yeah, just because, well, you talk about horse properties, and sometimes the barns are nicer than the houses. Yeah, down here there are a lot of polo goes on, and those horses are not merely well taken care of. Those horses are more pampered and protected than royalty. And yeah, it's not uncommon for somebody to build a 15,000 square foot house at $350 a square foot, and then they go out and build the barn at $500 a square foot. So when you get people who can afford stuff like that, and apparently there are thousands of them, if not millions, then to be comparable is not so much the house as it is the barn. So yeah, that's just where you just have to know the market, and quite frankly, that may require a relatively close relationship with a broker who works that market.
Yeah, sometimes, Marty, I'll see in reference to this question 21, sometimes I'll see the report answered where, there were on the top of page 2, it'll say there's 6 sold properties between, 275 and 325, and there's 1 active listing, between, or at 300,000. And I don't think that that's really what Fannie Mae's asking for here, especially if you transferred those same numbers to the top of page 1. That sounds to me more like it's the comps you selected for this particular assignment, not what is competing in that entire market. Now, maybe there's some areas where that is the case and there were only 6 sales to pick from, and they were all competitive and they should be reported that way. But in general, you look at it and you say, yep, that property would have made it in my grid on page 2 or 3 or 4 if it had, if it had been a newer sale or whatever. If I hadn't had the other ones that were there, to me, those are all properties that I would consider based on the principle of substitution, like what Tim described earlier with our 123 Elm Street example. So,
one of the problems that appraisers run into is they'll put on the top of page 2 there were 40 comparable sales, like the subject in the last 12 months, and then down somewhere in the narrative, the appraiser will say there weren't a lot of sales to choose from. Well, no. If there were 40 sales, there were a whole bunch of sales to choose from, and if there aren't a lot of sales to choose from, there weren't 40 sales. So it's that type of inconsistency and now misrepresentation that state boards jump all over, even though the appraiser really meant nothing by it. But, and this is a totally separate subject, but under the current definition of misleading, it's that kind of inconsistency that gets appraisers' certifications disciplined very severely.
Interesting. So I want to jump a little bit wider real quick, and this isn't on our outline, guys, but I think it's probably important for people to know.
Oh, good.
So just to drop this bomb on you guys. So can we talk for just a couple minutes, because I know we're running out of time, but can we talk about how you define the market and how you define a neighborhood?
Sure. Ideally, to define the neighborhood, you get a map. Remember those, Jared, from in our youth? You get a map and you put the subject in the exact middle of it, and then you start going outward, say in 100-yard concentric circles, until you get to the point where what influences the subject doesn't influence it anymore. That's a neighborhood. Okay. A market area is probably a little bit wider. Basically, how far would you drive to buy a gallon of milk? In some parts of Manhattan, you don't have to drive at all. You walk downstairs because there's a bodega on the ground floor of the building, and that's it. That's your market area, literally, that building. Whereas if you live in Alaska, you might have to get in your airplane and fly 2 hours to buy a gallon of milk. Well, okay, if that's what you're used to, that's what you're used to. But a neighborhood is defined as an area of complementary land uses, whereas a market area is defined as that area in which you would find properties competing with the subject, as well as shopping, schools, places of worship, places of recreation, etc. So, and note as well, and Jared, you know this as a USPAP instructor, USPAP does not use the word neighborhood. You will not find the word neighborhood in the USPAP document. That is strictly a Fannie Mae construct or a GS construct. And USPAP dropped it because of its racial overtones. So it's a bit confusing. We talk about analyzing the neighborhood, but yet the document that we're supposed to follow, USPAP doesn't even use the word neighborhood.
Neighborhood, right?
Yeah. So, and which is one of the reasons I say that USPAP is neither uniform nor standard, but my opinion is neither here nor there. There is a difference between a neighborhood and a marketing area. And technically, if you analyze the market area, you're probably also going to analyze the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Tim. I see sometimes when I'm looking at trending or trying to define what that area is, I'll digitally go into my MLS and I'll just create the boundaries, the physical boundaries first, and of my primary area where I'm going to hope to find my most relevant or most competing properties or sales. If in that first initial drawing, I don't get enough, I might get enough sales that are comparable and enough to fill out my grid and get my analysis done, but maybe I don't have enough for my trending. Maybe there's not enough sales in each of the months previous, the previous 6 quarters or however far back I want to go. But I know that if the property in my subdivision had not been for sale, they would have gone to a competing subdivision out of my initial boundaries that I drew. Then for my neighborhood, my neighborhood analysis, I will expand that out and grab all of those for my trending information. I'll go out and grab those other pocket neighborhoods that I know are competing, that have the similar influences, that go to the same jobs, that go to the same, they have the same major, market appeal, the same transportation nodes, the same school systems, those type of things that define it in my area. And everybody's area is a little bit different, and what those areas are. As you're listening to us, exactly what I'm talking about, and that gives me then enough information to say, here's what the overall market is doing within my neighborhood, even though my comps are very close and tight. That's kind of how I do it. I start by defining a geographic boundary. In my market, it's fairly easy, though. We have these mountains on one side and this lake on the other side, and it's very constrained geographically. And other areas, where if you're in the rural communities, you might go 40, 50 miles in between different areas and still be in a competitive scenario. You might be.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you. We're almost out of time, and we've only scratched the surface of neighborhood analysis, I think, and we've definitely only scratched the surface of Tim's essay. And Tim, I wanted to ask if anybody's interested in getting your essay or getting your ebook, what's the best place for them to go to get it?
Marty, thank you. My website is theappraisersadvocate.com, and you would go to theappraisersadvocate.com/products, and then it's the ebook on neighborhood analysis. And then my email is Tim at theappraisersadvocate.com, and send me an email, and I'll send you an invoice. And when PayPal sends me money, I'll just email the book to you. We keep it really simple down here. And remember, it's the Appraiser's Advocate. There's a very nice gentleman in New York State who is the Appraiser Advocate, and he's a fine gentleman, but we don't want each other's emails.
Right. All right, great. So either go to theappraisersadvocate.com or email Tim at tim@theappraisersadvocate.com.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Okay,
And I should tell you that I did just that and purchased it, and it is well worth the money that you spend. Tim has done a fantastic job, and I can't say enough about it. I thought it was a well put together, easy to read, and very entertaining at points too.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Marty, I should talk about one thing before we jump off here about DataMaster's new neighborhood tool. One of the things that we look at is tools that always keep the appraiser in control. Often it's the board, the state division, the real estate boards. The place you get in trouble is when you use a tool or you employ a method where the appraiser is not in control of that process or they don't understand the process. And our new neighborhood analysis tool allows the appraiser to always be in control of the data. You're going to feed us the data. We're not going to go and try and do a grab of all these sales or these listings in your MLS without your knowledge. And then we can easily compare. The other thing we built it to do was to be able to segment and compare two different contrasting data sets together, whether you want that to be a very tight competing market, and then the other set be this greater, broader neighborhood, or if you want to say, here's my 2 stories and here's my ramblers. You can use those data sets however you want to. The tool allows you the flexibility of mimicking whatever your market is and how you might need to slice and dice it. We don't ever want to come across as saying that we know exactly what you need in your area, but we'll build you the tool to be able to help you analyze that and provide graphs that are meaningful, statistics that are meaningful. We'll section out and parcel out the meaningful information out of that data set, those data sets that you give us. So it's a great tool. Check it out. It's just was released a couple of days ago, and we'll be excited to share it with you in future webinars.
Great, thanks, Jared. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So the neighborhood analysis in DataMaster is available, and we know it'll make your lives easier and keep you. DataMaster. Yeah.
Marty, you're freezing up a little bit there, so you might have. Yeah. You're.
Am I back now?
You're back now. Okay.
I just wanted to say that I want to say thanks, Tim, for joining us. Thanks, Jared. And just remember that DataMaster gives you the right data at the right time so you can make the right decision. We don't make the decisions for you. So have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, guys. It's an honor. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. You have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.